Extras.
The fury of Dovoneus did not rest. His rage at being bested by a mere mortal, rage at the limitations of form that had made such an indignity possible, at being struck down when he had already won, had moved on to laying the groundwork for a far greater game. Pawns were gathering in the west, but they needed a new king to rise, a warlord such as the world had never seen. The Shatter War was coming, but never again did Delvash assume mortal form. Yes, this minor noble, who came out of nowhere and through charisma, manipulation, and feats of heroism managed to rise to the throne of Korstrad, was the god of tyranny, Delvash in mortal guise. In the old days, most if not all the gods took mortal form at times for the experience of being immortal, seeing and feeling and being a part of the world from a new perspective. Usually they did so in an unassuming fashion, not seeking glory or fame, though Moradin was pretty unrestrained, which is why, after he left, the dwarves were able to put two and two together. If one god comes down into the world and tries to do things directly as a full avatar, a physical god, they would be very powerful, but that creates a mess, with mortals, spirits, and other gods rapidly intervening against them, or maybe on both sides. And whatever you might accomplish, you are opening a can of worms, which may prompt the other gods to do the same in ways you don't appreciate. It's also true that when manifesting physically, the more of a god's power they use, the more it will mess them up if something goes wrong and they are defeated. And if a whole bunch of avatars come out openly and mix it up, somebody's getting defeated. Do you want to roll those dice? Now, when a god takes mortal form, as opposed to forming a divine avatar, that still occupies their conscious self. An immortal can contain only a fraction of the deity's knowledge, while losing access to the vast amount of information they receive from the astral sea. It is akin to being blind and deaf if you also lost most of your sense of touch. As long as they are alive, they will be oblivious to what other gods are doing, and there are various other drawbacks. The short version is, the more power you grant your mortal form at the time of creation, the more it takes out of you if you die. The longer it will take for the god to recover, unless they die of natural causes. Though a god in mortal form can choose the time of their passing. They can simply go off and meditate for a few hours and release themselves, or, if they so choose, die in their sleep. It's said that Dialia, goddess of nature, can take mortal form as an animal and suffers no ill if her animal form dies of natural causes or predation, as long as her animal form is killed and eaten by the hunter. In fact, it's said that she can, and frequently does, manifest in the world as multiple animals at once, if they are smaller, shorter-lived ones. It costs her little or nothing, as they die and their essence returns to her. But Delvash is a very powerful god, possibly the most powerful, ignoring distant gods, having stolen all Tiamat's domains, plus most of the ones which she had in turn stolen from Pelor. And as the god of tyranny, Delvash has strong opinions on how the world should be organized. And so, when he manifested as Dovoneus, it was not on a whim. His location, his race, his appearance, his timing, all was chosen with great deliberation, and was but one element in a vast web of plans to unite the world, to create an absolute order under the lineage of the first god-king of the continent, and eventually the world. Delvash had been manipulating the primitive orcs of Uruk for generations, subtly directing their culture and some more direct divine manipulation, trying to give rise to a mighty conqueror, a warlord the likes of which had not been seen in these lands since the time of the three brothers themselves. In that unbound sight of the gods, their ability to glimpse events beyond time, or perhaps paths, like branches on a tree, in that sight, Delvash had two candidates for a mighty, world-rending orc warlord. This warlord, the Varharan, who would shake the foundations of the kingdoms of elves, of dwarves, of Adar, and of men. But neither had yet been born, and whichever of them was chosen, whichever would lead Uruk to war, that was only part of their purpose. Their true purpose, in the eyes of the evil god, was to die to the blade of Dovoneus, granting the God King the global triumph he would need with which to unify the kingdoms of men. They would likely not worship Delvash, not openly, not yet. But their devotion to him through the rule of law would serve well enough until his descendants, the future kings and queens born of the god's blood, would change that in time. The mortal called Dovoneus was crafted with full knowledge of who he was, something most other gods avoid when seeking the mortal experience. He also had the knowledge of his divine self's plan, and as much other knowledge, wisdom, and omens of possible future events as could be contained in that vessel. His form was tall, strong, graceful, and handsome, a reflection of the subconscious perceptions of the citizens of Korstrad, their image of an ideal leader, warrior, and diplomat, at least for the city dwellers. In order for his heroism to shine, and to aid both his ascension to the throne and his ultimate task of defeating the Orc warlord, Dovoneus was as strong, swift, and tough as any mortal man. But Delvash knew that would not be enough, so he cleverly granted himself the ability to access far greater strength, speed, and durability than any human, when needed, but only temporarily, in an attempt to avoid the trap of granting too much power. As long as he did not die while tapping this unholy strength, the god of darkness, pride, hatred, greed, and so much more, could avoid the costs incurred by dying while investing too much in his physical form. With the power and guile granted to him, and driven by his sinister divine purpose, Dovoneus appeared out of nowhere, presenting himself as a down-on-his-luck noble, with a story that was quite plausible and too much effort for the court of the Winter Palace to look into. He didn't claim to be wealthy or powerful, quite the opposite. Essentially all he claimed was to be a low-ranking member of the noble caste, and he played the part so well there was no real reason to doubt him. He ingratiated himself to all, being an excellent guest, and rounded out his reputation with mighty deeds in service to the crown and to the people of Korstrad. And thus, guided by breadcrumbs of foreknowledge, it was almost too easy to position himself as heir to the throne, causing the unhealthy monarch to fall gravely ill, barely even qualified as a miracle. The foreknowledge granted to Dovoneus told him that once he became king, there were only 3 major obstacles which threatened his ultimate goal. The greatest threat of the 3 was the possibility that the Elven or Eladrin royals would recognize his true nature, or otherwise grow suspicious of him. This was not a problem which could be smashed with brute force, nor one easily disarmed by his charms. It would take decades of complex, subtle manipulation of many factors to give him the best chance to avoid the wrong kind of attention from the wisest of the Eldar. The next greatest threat was that he would fail to defeat the Varharan, either that the powerful Orc warlord might best him, or that another hero might defeat the Varharan too soon, before Dovoneus was ready. But of course, once Delvash had taken mortal form, he lost the ability to manipulate the Orcs any further, forced to rely on his previous preparations and on the metaphysical power all gods have, regardless of where their mind is, to subconsciously apply their will to their domains at the granular, universal level. When given a choice, a chance to show pride or hatred or fear, the will of Delvash would nudge them in that direction, in whatever way would most likely benefit his schemes. Dovoneus, in mortal guise, could only have faith in his true self to have set the pieces in motion, and to have prepared for him the right visions and omens to lead him to victory. The third greatest threat was seen in one of those omens, that a great warrior would arise from the nomads to challenge him. Dovoneus knew that if he fought this warrior, his fate would lie in the balance, uncertain, based only on his own strength and prowess, but he knew little else of it. So he had been working from the beginning to find great warriors among the tribes, and to make sure that they either joined him, or that they killed each other off. When Gargama died, between his vengeful rage and his oaths to serve Dovoneus, his spirit managed to cling to this world long enough to doom Hinze by warning the usurper king. And so, when this Hinze barbarian appeared on the doorstep of the Winter Palace, the nomad was banished to the dungeons, to be held there until death, avoiding the pretentious battle altogether. With this threat imprisoned, the God King thought little more of it, turning his attention ever onward to his glorious task, to preparing for the scrutiny by the elves, and to preparing the nation, his nation, to ensure that when the Orcish waves crashed down upon the world, Korstrad would be the rock against which they broke, an orderly and strong military power, ready to take leadership in the alliance of elves and men. And so Dovoneus was now less worried about the fated warrior than he was about the Duchess Sunderland, who, although already dead by this time, had seen through his facade, a mere human without the ancient magic and wisdom wielded by the oldest of the Eldar. The damage she may have done. Oh, how she had earned that assassin's blade. Not only had she rescued a potential future rival for the throne, but much worse, she may have raised the alertness of the elves, making it that much more likely that King Dietrich or Queen Floretta would scrutinize the new king to their north in ways which could threaten all his schemes. Some day he or his descendants would destroy them and add their forests to his empire, but until the Varharan died, that goal was too far off to warrant much of his attention. The gods, all the gods, act constantly upon every stone, every blade of grass, every beast and monster and mind in the universe, according to their wishes, within the scope of each of their divine domains. Larathol and Blabal war over every mist, cloud, and wave. Delvash pushes all to strike down, take what they can, while Sirius pushes to instead enrich their own spirits by standing between the weak and the strong. You can easily overanalyze any event in this light, but so many strange and unlikely and wondrous turns of fate worked to give Hinze his chance, that surely the gods must have had some hand, subconsciously trying to stop Delvash, just as he subconsciously furthered his own schemes. But most of all, some part must have been played by Marduk, who some named Cord or Grumsh. For of all the things in the world, what he loves most is to see the strong challenge the strong, each fighting for a mighty cause, and to let their contest play out in the greatest possible way. Though he paid little heed to the little man in his darkened cell, Dovoneus had no interest in keeping Hinze alive. The only reason he was in prison and not an unmarked grave was that the king of tyrants knew his kingdom too well. The greatest wisdom he possessed was the knowledge of how far a nation, a people, could be pushed without resistance, without planting the seeds of eventual rebellion. Korstrad had its own sense of what justice meant, and to that he must stay true, at least for now. So to prison went the barbarian, instead of to the hangman. After only a few months, however, long enough that few people would remember the arrival and arrest of one stranger from the east, Dovoneus sent a lackey down to the deepest dungeons in secret to have the jailers stop wasting food on the man in the lightless cell. Let him starve to death in utter darkness. But the warden that Dovoneus had appointed, a man who would obey any law however cruel, and who is said not to have a shred of mercy in him, refused outright. That is tantamount to execution, he said, and no man would be executed without an official order. The lackey barked and threatened, but the steely-eyed warden did not fear a leech who simply attached himself to power. If the king would come down in person and order it, if he'd summon the warden to the throne room and command him, if Dovoneus would send a writ decreeing it, the warden would cut the man to death with the corners of that very paper. But no man under his care would die without a legal order. And while the warden had no fear as long as he held to his convictions, the same could not be said of the lackey, who feared the king's reaction should he report this failure. And so the coward reported only that he had instructed the jailers as asked, and by this omission unwittingly saved Hinze's life, whilst the warden, in absence of any order to the contrary, took extra care to ensure the nomad remained in good health, that no accidents should occur which would make a mockery of his principles. Meanwhile, King Dovoneus recruited new dukes to rule over the nomads of the north and their vast seasonal hunting grounds. Since the beastly Gargama had failed, he turned instead to choosing members of the same ethnic groups as the tribes, but individuals who happened to have been raised and educated in the capital, including young Ikoro. To hold the highest ranks in his new regime, the Dark King required men and women to swear their lives to him in an elaborate, secret ceremony. Though the words of the oath, which the supplicants repeated, could not have been more clear, few of them likely realized the gravity of the divine ritual by which they became bound. Those who swore the oath were blessed with a skill and eloquence when executing the will of Dovoneus, but bound by his ritual, their lives belonged to him, to do with as he willed. And so it came to pass that one of these young tyrants, Duke Ikoro, came upon an unexpected prize. One of his spies caught a certain lackey in a drunken state, and learned that the man had failed to have killed a prisoner, an enemy of the king. Ikoro had been placed in charge of the next gladiatorial games, and he had many ideas for savage entertainment. But learning of this barbarian, who would shock the king by simply being alive, and whose death would surely please him, Ikoro wasted no time in visiting the deep, dark cell. And the warden could not question the broad authority he had been given to recruit prisoners for the games. And so Hinze appeared in the arena, alive and well, much to the king's furious surprise, when he not only failed to die, but slew the same dragon Dovoneus had captured, allowing him to credibly challenge the mighty warrior. Dovoneus saw the omen he had sought to avoid made very real. Nothing was certain now, except that he must crush this man, this walking symbol of his lack of control, or watch all his plans crumble. So though he passed the fool Ikoro without so much as a glance, as soon as the king stood in the blood-soaked dirt, with all eyes upon him, he called in Ikoro's oath. With no more than a thought, his servant gave his life, exactly as pledged. After the battle, when the god of pride had unlocked more and more of his unholy strength, yet failed in his gambit, he died ignominiously, at least in his own mind. His mortal body failed, and his divine consciousness was freed, but in a grossly weakened state. For dying while using all that power cost Delvash the very costs he had tried to cheat his way out of. He had failed to keep the kingdom, his chance to bind and rule the continent, to establish a dynasty. All his plans lay in ruins. Dovoneus had not even married to Siren Heir, for though many suitors had thrown themselves at his feet, he had not wanted an heir to a mere kingdom, but rather to sire an heir to an empire. And the match he sought, the possible brides Delvash had selected before Dovoneus even existed, had still been more than a decade away. Delvash, returning to his full divine knowledge and wisdom, was burned, tortured by hindsight, seeing the endless ways in which he could have succeeded, failure and rage turning his endless pride against himself. But with godly perspective, he now saw the cards which remained to him, the Orcs and the Varharan. For centuries he had been preparing the Greenskins for a savage war of conquest. Though his plan had been to defeat them, that victory would have meant nothing unless they were a threat to all nations around them, and their leader had to be a warrior truly worthy of defeating. Without Dovoneus, Korstrad would be weak. the alliance less than it would have been. And so Delvash mustered his remaining resources. The timescale was much shorter, mere decades, making the new changing plan positively hasty for the evil god. But he began summoning dark forces from below to keep the dwarfholds out of the war, giving the orcs at least one safe flank. And as the candidates for warlord were born and grew up, he tested them both, chose his Varharan, and granted the orc divine visions and dark blessings of power and of conquest. It began with orc raids, the kind which have always plagued trade between Korstrad and the Elven lands to the south, as well as the North Pad, which connected Korstrad and Vistria, and dwarven trade routes emanating from the mountains of the Iron Sea. The type regularly frightened off, if not crushed, by organized military forces, be they humans, elves, or dwarves. But these orcs turned tail and fled at the first sign of force, even more cowardly than their usual strength and numbers tactics, and naturally elven rangers or Vistrian or Korstradi patrols would often give chase, trying to run down and destroy the broken units rather than allow them to escape. And they found that these broken orcs collapsed back with a degree of intention that belied their ragged-looking formation. But in most cases, before their pursuers could question it, they found themselves surrounded by hidden orcish reinforcements or found themselves subject to rockfalls or other terrain-based ambushes. No one would accuse the orc leaders of being strategic geniuses, but the sudden introduction of any competent planning, where none had existed before, was frightening and effective in the short term, and was only the beginning. While harrying civilized nations on other sides, the orcs began an organized campaign on the borders of Vistria to their northeast, overwhelming and seizing border forts and listening posts in rapid succession. Many orcs died, but many of the attacks succeeded, allowing them to push further and further before defenders could reorganize or reinforce their next layer of defenses. And soon, the forces of Uruk had destroyed Vistria's eyes and ears, killing over 1,000 soldiers, and effectively taking control of almost all of Angor province. A strong response was required, and so Queen Jasmine von Smith raised a sizable army, which she led alongside her adventurer half-sister Charlie's band of friends, the Archtide Dragoons. Based on the reports, they advanced cautiously, with many brave advanced scouts probing for ambushes or for smaller orc forces positioned to coalesce into a flanking position. But instead, they found one giant, unified war horde, line after line, column after column of orcs, brazenly challenging the kingdom's power. Though there was no uniform per se, they were all clearly unified by the iron chain each of them wore over their shoulder, like a sash, the symbol of the Varharan, the large orc standing ominously alone at their fore. The orc who had united all the clans, and whose strength had brought 20,000 greenskins to this spot to face down Vistria's strongest warriors. As proud daughters of the smith, Charlie and the queen stood their ground. Though outnumbered more than 3-1, the 6,000-strong Vistrian force included a good proportion of crossbowmen and 1,200 cavalry, 400 of which were heavy knights, noblemen and noble women in full armor, many with blades, axes, or hammers passed down by centuries of heroes. A charge of 1,000 thundering cavalry could break a light infantry horde that size, even if they were men, and these were but orcs. And so Queen Jasmine raised high the sovereign sword of Vistria, which was called Giantsbane, and as she leveled it towards the orc leader, charge they did. The shaking earth, as so many lances approached, made many of the orcs flinch or shuffle nervously. But they dared not break their lines, for they feared the warlord at their head far more than bolts and horses and men. The Varharan raised his massive sword, and led a chant of its name. Kill Dar! Kill Dar! 20,000 gruff throats rose the rhythmic sound. Kill Dar! Kill Dar! Among orcs, the length of names was a statement of strength. Claiming a 2-syllable name was enough to provoke assault from other orcs, unless they believed that you were indeed stronger. The warlord wielded his own assumed name, Varharan, as a challenge to all, a challenge which he had won again and again until all submitted to his power. Varharan was so strong that he gave even his weapon a 3-syllable name, Kiltorjar, made up of death words in the tongues of orc, elf, and human. And when the riders drew near enough, the warlord struck down at the ground, and at that signal, handlers across his horde's front yanked chains up from their dusty camouflage. Huge scorpions which had lain buried in wait, calmed by shamanic magic until this moment, burst up from the ground with clamping pincers and great venomous tails raised to threatening height, causing nearly all of the Vistrian horses to balk or throw their riders. Gordar Dustbeard, the wizard of the Archtide Dragoons, cast down bolts of lightning from his hands, creating a space for the royal party to continue charging at the orc leader. But when Kiltorjar, the blade of the Varharan, struck the sovereign sword of Vistria, that sword, one of 3 gifted by Moradin to the true sons of Smith, was shattered, its enchantment breaking in a blast that threw back the riders, the Varharan, all who lay nearby. The battle became chaos, a slaughterous, murderous, fighting retreat by the army of men. Heroic Charlie, Dustbeard, and the other surviving members of her party dragged Queen Jasmine's body back, finding enough uninjured mounts to rejoin the main force, and those remaining dragoons organized the units as they fell back. But by the end of the day, more than half the humans were slain. Over 3,000 dead, and though half again that many orcs also perished, there was no question of the winning side, no question of the power of the Varharan. And as word of the battle spread, so this conflict, this orc invasion, gained a name. For the blow that ended the sword and injured the queen so gravely that she was not seen again for a month, and was said never to remove her helm again in public, so badly was she scarred, so angry was she at the loss of her sister. Across the world, the conflict came to be known as the Shatter War. Oh, and if that last paragraph got confusing at the end, read it again, and remember that almost every legend told in my world has some detail wrong, sometimes simply through errors in repetition, or failings of memory, sometimes through intentional attempts by certain parties to shape the history of the world. So if you thought that sounded weird, reread that last paragraph, maybe the last couple, and see if you can pinpoint the note of discord and see the truth hidden beneath the tale. As for Delvash, god of hatred, fear, darkness, and so many other evils, the shattering of one sword, of one queen, was only the beginning of his vengeance. The Orc War he had arranged changed the world forever, in many ways. In some ways which pleased Delvash to no end. In some others, clearly not as Delvash intended, since even without mighty Dovoneus and his fascist Korstrad, the orcs were defeated in the end. But even the death of the Eladrin king, which so angered Dialia, was very clearly the dark hand of Delvash at work, for King Kelvoras was slain by Jarmarkar, the Varharan's lieutenant, who had been the god's second prospective candidate, the one Delvash had not chosen to be warlord. I want to give a big thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons. There were a good chunk of good questions for this already long video, so I'm going to post a separate video for them. Thanks so much for your continued support, with a special shout out to Lord Abon, Duskmar, Big Grin, Gorefiend, and Surf USA, the members of the organization. And if you don't feel like supporting my channel financially, that's okay, but if you like it, please share Tales from my D&D campaign on Twitter, or Facebook, or wherever you do your social media-izing. And their battle became legend